I'm Jennifer Evans. I am the Treasurer for the Social History Society, and I'm an early modern historian, and I'm chairing this panel with Cara. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Cara. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Bodies and Emotions strand. I'm an early career researcher, and I'm also the ECR officer for the Society for Social History and Medicine. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to these papers. I think we're going to get some great discussions.
Okay, so we'll make a start with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Virginia Baptista, who is going to be talking to us about women's bodies in art and represented emotions. She's a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History, the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and she's working on a really interesting project at the moment called Women Workers, Health and Medicine in Portugal. So I'll hand over to Virginia.
Yes, thank you. In first place, I would like to thank the Social Story Society, the organization of this event, and to welcome my colleagues of the section Bodies and Emotions. My presentation is part of a research that I am still doing. Fundamentally, I desire to raise some questions about the representation of women's bodies by some significant women artists from the Renaissance to the contemporaneity from different cultures. The discussion about the body and the emotions is a fundamental subject of social science today. I start with sociologist Adrian Scribano and anthropologist Mauro Cori's statement that bodies are marked by the political, cultural, and social logics that produce and consume them as object and subject of sociability. As discussed in several historiographic studies and clearly demonstrated by sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, since the ancestral societies, women have been subject to male power due to the hegemony of patriarchal society. Thus, the arts have also been a male domain, and women have been represented according to the canons of male gaze and scrutiny, an idealistic representation of the body of woman. Women until recently were only the muses. I intend to demonstrate that women artists have established ruptures with traditional androcentric vision and social and political representations of the woman body, based on their new experience and activism on which they have been integrated. I took as a starting point the controversial question raised by the historian of art Linda Nochlin: why have there been no great woman artists? I tried to discover what are the subjects and emotions about the bodies represented throughout the history of women artists. We must remember that in the 20s, Virginia Woolf, in her essay, A Room of Own, made evident the relevance of the existence in the domestic space of a private room for women writers, and thus for all women artists. Since the late 60s, the question of women's emancipation has been analyzed in depth by studies of the history of woman, gender, and post-colonialism. These studies, also insert in art, intend to rebuild history in an anti-racist, non-sexist, and anti-capitalist perspective defended, for example, by Angela Davis. The historian Michel Perrault pointed out, and the difference between the sexes that marks the bodies occupies a central position in the story. And I think that because the male body was seen as normal, and the female body was seen for a long time as minor, sick, or even hysterical. Next, I will give some examples of women artists who broke with the normalization of women bodies that reflect different emotions transposed to their works. For example, since the Renaissance to the Baroque, we have some women artists, Sofonisba Anguissola, Lavinia Fontana, Artemisa Gentileschi, that despite reduced to their private spaces, painted women bodies from mythology, goddesses, heroics, or ordinary women. The French painter Bertrand Morisot inserted in Impressionism, although her access to public space was restricted, the critics were favorable to her work, and many adjectivized it as more pleasant compared to her colleagues. Some of her paintings reflect the time, representation, emotions, resulting from motherhood, like affection, tenderness. Camille Claudel recently recuperated this story of art, sculpted the false, a couple of sensual bodies with passion, intertwined in great harmony, dancing naked in the late 19th century. The American artist Roman Brooks was the first known woman painter that consciously forged a new lesbian visual imaginary in early 20th century. She was a lesbian woman, and she produced the representation of powerful woman in a posture of trust, dominance, destabilizing the usual categories of female and male. Other example is the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, made several self-portraits that evoke the Mexican identity of woman, her physical vulnerability and anguish due to the serious accident she suffered when she was young and questioning their place in the world. The German artist Irma Stern introduced modernism into a conservative and racist society in South Africa. She acquired many visions and a great creativity about African women, and art came out of European white political and social standards, showing the importance of acceptance and appreciation of the other. Also, the Swedish Monica Chu, who was a feminist in the painting God-Given Birth, represented a non-white woman given birth that led her to be accused of blasphemy and obscenity. The American Nancy Sparrow was a feminist, and her work is central in showing social and political issues in the representation related to sexuality, violence to women, and the control of their bodies under the patriarchy. Finally, Paula Rego, a Portuguese feminist artist, defensor of women's rights, paints stories, theoretical compositions with female bodies that do not appear in traditional male narratives. Without any symbolism in the triptych Devotion, she criticized the results of the referendum in Portugal to decriminalize abortion, where the no won. In this series, the woman is placed in situations of great vulnerability with uncomfortable and unpleasant postures being visible to the observer, or the reality of termination of pregnancy, then constantly in great solitude. Finally, some final reflections. Historical, the art was a male domain during a long time. Women's bodies were passive, idealized according to the wish of those who ordered the work and the desires of men, and women were only viewed as models or muses. At the beginning of the 20th century, women entered to the fine art schools, had new experience, contact humans, and the abolitionist movement made trips abroad, visit to museums, came into contact also with new male models. They saw diversified subjects. So the bodies painted and sculpted by women artists acquired new forms, materials, textures, emotions, and change, still in emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Virginia. That was fantastic. Okay, so our second speaker today is Kate Brooks, who will be talking to us about imperialist photography, Victorian respectability, and Dickens' Blank Child as an analysis of the Orphanage scrapbook. Kate is an associate lecturer in education, history and heritage at Sbaraini University. She's taught for many years in cultural studies and screen media, and she's published a number of books and journal articles on this, so I'm not going to list them all, but you can Google her work and find it for yourself. And she's currently undertaking a doctoral thesis on the history of children in institutionalised care. Over to you, Kate.
So I'm going to be talking about a photograph I found during my time in the Muller Archives in Bristol, and I want to suggest what themes I think that photograph represents. So it's kind of following on from the previous paper, but in a different kind of direction. So firstly, this is one of 5 of George Muller's famous orphan homes, built in 1836, and in their day, internationally renowned. As I say, this is one of them. The 5 all across the Bristol skyline housed about 2,000 orphans at any one time. George Muller himself is a really fascinating character. He's an evangelical Christian preacher. He's co-founder of the Plymouth Brethren. He's a story for another day. So the orphanages slightly predate around about the same time, or they start around about the same time as Bristol Suspension Bridge. But slightly predating that, in the days before the bridge, Muller's was one of the places that you would, if you were on a little charabanc tour of Bristol, you might look at this, the Avon Gorge, an asylum for hopeful female prisoners, and maybe Bristol Zoo, which opened the same year as the orphan houses. So a kind of a big deal in Bristol. And I want to talk to you about, oh, that's just a little bit of an example. That's one of the guidebooks that talks about the Muller homes. So I want to talk to you about this photograph. And it would be lovely to be able to see your immediate reactions to this, because I think it's a really striking photograph. I think because it tells us in a very visual way about how the children were categorised and quite literally framed in particular ways, which I'm going to argue are ideologically entangled with the wider context of Victorian society. So another kind of theme of bodies and what they represent kind of ideologically in their social context. To me, in the very kind of strange way that these bodies are styled, it recalls some of the turn of the century hospital photographs in which the body of the disabled individual was illustrated as interacting with the machines or being served by the machines. We saw that in Lucy Durlap's paper last week, and also in George Gosling's paper. Both were talking about war veterans and the ways in which they were seen to be interacting with machines. And in both papers there, the emphasis was on being useful, how these bodies could be useful, making taxpayers out of beggars, to quote a children's hospital in the early 1900s. So I want to place the paper in the social context, and then go on to just quickly talk about a couple of themes. As you probably know, Henry Fox Talbot exposed the first photography negatives in the window of Laycock Abbey in 1835, the year before the orphanage opened. By the 1850s, large commercial firms, large commercial photography studios were set up in Park Street in Bristol, quite near the zoo, producing postcards and individual prints, which were some of the most widely marketed of the new consumer goods of the 19th century. So people would have them on display on a mantelpiece, and they would include pictures of places you've been to, or royalty, or the colonies, or exotic animals, and so on. A number of the Muller photographs feature groups standing outside the studio of J.W. Cara. So there's just some adverts for the photographers. I love this picture because everyone in it looks really grumpy, typical family kind of pose, although these are children from the orphanage. So you can see I'm pointing, you can't see that. The sign at the top says J.W. Cara, artist and photographer. And I wondered, that with this picture that's much more natural than we'd expect from turn of the century photographs, and the very modernist kind of angular images of this picture, whether the photographer was trying something a bit more artistic and challenging, trying to maybe appeal perhaps to new benefactors, to donators, to maybe the new bourgeoisie who might want something a bit kind of arty and different on their mantelpieces. So that's kind of a bit of context. The themes I want to talk about with this photograph are the lightness and the brightness, the angular pose, and firstly the identical dress, because as you can see they're all dressed absolutely identically. Dickens, after a visit to a London orphanage, talks about the blank child. He wrote an essay called The Blank Child, and it's a play on words from the certificate that you'd have to fill in, or the form that you'd have to fill in when you delivered a child, delivered a blank child. And it's significant here that what's emphasised is their blank similarity. By emphasising the sameness of the Muller orphans, the photographer and the institution create this composite portrait of a Muller girl, a standard type, I think, perhaps for potential mistresses looking for kind of good servants. So these children are notable here, not for their genetic uniqueness, like we would, find pleasure in old family photographs where, you've got your great Aunt Mabel's eyes or whatever, but they're institutionalized similarities. They've got identical clothes, identical hair, you take identical poses. So it's almost like this is a standard, a brand. And I don't think this is necessarily deliberate on the part of the institution. It's a kind of visual symbol of the time. This is a recommended brand of servant. This was a time obsessed with hereditary traits, which I think is important to think about. But also with servants, housemaids like footmen a bit earlier, were often given generic names. So you might be orphan number 457 here. You would go on to be a Mary, scullery maid as an adult, and maybe never even use your baptismal name. So that's one kind of theme that I'm exploring in the article that I'm writing at the moment. The second theme is the bare white room. I think the whiteness of the room, the light, both emphasize not just the bodies, but also kind of lightness, brightness, and both of those things are ideologically significant and visual symbols at the time of health. Even the light-giving blue glass of the photography technology was seen as health-giving. Pains curing pains, and a blue glass bathe which would cure the blues. So whiteness and light symbolised physical and moral goodness, respectability, cleanliness. The Bristol Guidebook describes this institution as having snowy white linen, whitewashed walls, spacious, lofty, austere cleanliness and spotless surfaces. And I think this can be contrasted ideologically with the symbolism of darkness, of dirt and disease. The founder of the Salvation Army in the 1870s, William Booth, talked of the slums as the dark, fetid swamps, darkest England like darkest Africa. Destitute homeless children were known as street Arabs. I think that's got a kind of interesting racist and imperialist connotation. Another newspaper report in 1864 talks about the poor as a caste apart, a race of whom we know nothing. And I think this photograph then is implying consciously or subconsciously that these children are free of the dark diseases and dark existences of Victorian poverty. The third and final theme is the pose. One of my other immediate reactions was that you'd have to be really strong to hold this pose on quite a hard looking floor for the long exposure of a Victorian camera. This visual of children as blank, light, useful, clean and respectable and fit can be mapped onto 19th century discourses of a good servant. Here's another Muller picture. A good servant, states an 1873 poem, is sober, honest and discreet, clean and neat. A good servant will scrub well the floors and make them white with a noiseless step and watchful eye. So fitness, nimbleness, the ability to silently and efficiently step around the house is important. One child in the Muller Institute is deemed too flat-footed for placement, another is too small. A Guide to Good Housekeeping in 1864 advises every servant, every utensil, every fixture should have a right place. In other words, the picture shows these children have cleaned up, can fit in, are fit and fit for purpose, and they know their place. So some final thoughts. This picture is, I would argue, doing ideological work, consciously or subconsciously. It's mirroring in its glass lens the social, moral and political concerns of Victorian ideology and society. It creates a particular way of seeing. The Muller child here exists as a type who, with the right benevolent guidance, can be moulded to fit in, to be useful. I think it suggests by implication and opposition the more murky fates these girls may have suffered if they had not been brought into the light of this Christian institution. Perhaps most significantly, it presents these children for our gaze. Inmates of the Victorian Orphanage, like other institutions, like asylums, like the zoo, were tourist landmarks, places to go and visit. And the children of Muller's Orphanage then are similarly othered in these photographs, are seen as another cast apart, a collective, a tribe, almost as exotic. It's notable to say here that Muller's would parade the children through Bristol annually, a 2,000 strong crocodile. This picture doesn't quite show the massive sense of the crocodile. It's huge. It did bring the city to a standstill. But I like this photo because I really love the way that the children are both kind of staring at each other really curiously. Passers-by or onlookers, as you can see here, would call out, "Here come the Orphs." And like I say, it was a regular kind of quite spectacular event. Newspapers would report on it. So that's not to say that those running the orphanage intended the way of seeing that I'm talking about. But I think this photo represents those values, this way of seeing children as both spectacular objects of lurid imperialistic fascination, but also of sentimental pity and curiosity. So we never know the names, we don't know the names of these individual children. We don't know their individual histories. So I think we can say in the most English and Victorian way, these children are seen but not heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That was really fascinating. Thanks both for two great papers to start us off.
Thank you very much, Cara, and thank you to our speakers. Our next speaker is Vicky Holmes, and she'll be talking to us about the boss-lodger, the complications of the landlady-landlord-lodger relationship in Victorian England. Vicky has been working on working class homes and is currently looking at the lives of lodgers. I've heard you speak about lodgers before, so I'm very excited about this. And she is author of In Bed with the Victorians, The Life Cycle of Working Class Marriage, which was published by Palgrave in 2017. So if you want to see more of her work, you can look for that. Thank you, Vicky.
Right, I'll just get my screen shared with you. Also, if you are interested in Bed with the Victorians, make sure you get it during Palgrave's sale when it's £9.99. Don't pay £40 for it. So domestic violence frequently arose in the proceedings of the Victorian Coroner's Court and has, for the historian, these were generally recorded in some detail in the local press, which thankfully during this time are still widely accessible due to digitisation, which has been really helpful actually, because I've got a toddler, so I haven't had a lot of time, and being able to employ a research assistant during this to gather me some more newspaper reports, because it still takes awfully long time, but nothing compared to a microfilm in the archives. So having used these press reports and surviving coroner's records to explore the tumultuous relationships between a husband and a wife, I'm now turning my attention to the landlady-lodger relationship as part of a wider examination of lodging in Victorian England. I've looked at various cases of lodgers before, as Jen stated, but the more inquests I find, the more shocking examples I'm coming across. So today's short paper looks at 3 examples of domestic violence existing in this complex relationship, with the overarching question of why, in a society that sanctioned the female body only to be abused by a husband to a point, did the lodger's violent behaviour towards his landlady appear to go unchecked? So the first case I want to discuss is that involving the landlady of Mrs. Mary Allen of 17 Lomas Street, Burnley, Lancashire. Separated from her husband, Allen took in lodgers in order to look after herself and keep a roof over her head. Oh, sorry, computer's just doing something. Okay. In June 1897, the then aged 57-year-old Allen was murdered in front of her lodgers as they sat down to their midday meal that she prepared for them. The perpetrator, 40-year-old labourer William Crossley, was known in the household as the boss lodger. He acquired this title because, as one of the newspaper reports stated, he regularly gave his wages to Mrs. Allen, went out shopping with her, and treated her in every way a man should treat his wife, even sharing a bed. Neighbours providing testimony at the coroner's inquest revealed the pair had led a quarrelsome life, from which it was surmised it can hardly be supposed that the landlady would have tolerated such conduct on the part of a lodger had the relationship between her and Crossley been of a different character to that of the ordinary landlady and lodger. Yet despite this blurring, he was still clearly a lodger, as demonstrated in the insecurity of his living arrangement. With his increasingly jealous behaviour and upon the assistance of her daughter, Mrs. Allen told Crossley he must seek fresh lodgings. When the case came to trial, Crossley's line of defence was that he believed that Mrs. Allen, her daughter, and another lodger named Robert Chadwick were conspirators whose object was to remove him from his position as boss lodger, and this suspicion drove him mad. Crossley also suspected Chadwick of having intimate relationships with his landlady, whom Crossley attempted but failed to kill along with Allen's daughter. Convicted, William Crossley was executed by hanging at Strangeways in the late July. He showed no remorse for his actions, stating he would do the same thing again. In the second case, while the term boss lodger is not used by any of the witnesses, it is evident that 53-year-old Ipswich bricklayer John Miller fulfilled this role. When he was called before the Ipswich coroner in December 1879 to testify to the circumstances surrounding the death of his landlady, 80-year-old widow Mary Daniels, he revealed to the court that he was a married man. His wife had left him and gone off with someone else. Upon this separation, he had taken up lodgings with Daniels, who routinely took lodgers in for a substantial part of her married and widowed life. And what you can see on the slide is the 1871 census, where we can see at the bottom Thomas Daniels and his wife having taken in lodger George Granger. Unfortunately, with all the cases in the newspapers, unlike the first case, which is murder case, you tend not to get photos, prints of the lodger and the landlady, disappointingly. So elderly widows, as Leonore Davidoff has suggested, often filled that maternal marital gap in their lodgers' lives. Even in increasing old age, these women could find themselves acting as quasi-wives. Although one must really question the consensual nature of such relationships when they became sexual. Certainly in the aforementioned case, it was suggested that Crossley had a perversion for older women, and this also appears to be the case for John Miller. Miller reveals that the relationship between himself and his landlady, nearly 30 years his senior, had become blurred. They were, at the time of her death, he stated, living together as man and wife, and he and Mary occupied one bed. This was much to the surprise of Daniel's son, who, residing elsewhere in the town, told the coroner's court that he thought Miller only lived there as a lodger. The relationship, however, was not a harmonious one. Atalena King, a neighbour, stated that Daniels and Miller had not been on the best terms lately. She'd heard the latter threaten Daniels, who sometimes cried, and she knew that Miller had knocked her against the walls. Daniels' other lodgers also witnessed these quarrels and physical abuse close hand. At the close of the inquest, the coroner stated that his distress at the improper relationship. However, his distress was not in regards for the violence existing in the relationship, but simply because Miller was married to another woman at the time. It's also evident that neither those under Daniel's roof and those who heard the violence through the walls saw it necessary to intervene. After the death of his landlady or paramour, John Miller moved on into new lodgings. By 1881, now aged 55 years, John Miller was residing at 28 Black Horse Lane, and this was the lodging house of his 72-year-old widow who lived with her 18-year-old granddaughter. And whether Miller formed a quasi-marital bed with either of these women can only be speculated upon. So the third and final case that I want to discuss is perhaps the most complicated of these in terms of sanctified domestic violence. In 1894, Ipswich labourer and labourer, 40-year-old John Last, died of pneumonia in his landlord and landlady's home. Called to provide evidence at the inquest, his landlady, Maria Vincent, stated that Last had lodged in her home for the past 14 years. In recent times, she revealed that Last had become a heavy drinker. During these drinking bouts, she found herself the target of his violent outbursts. She stated at the coroner's inquest into her lodger's death, on Friday week, he was intoxicated and ill-treated her, as was his custom. A week or two back, he gave her a black eye. Such was the violence on some occasions that she had to fetch her husband. Given the routine physical abuse that Maria Vincent was suffering at the hands of her lodger, I'm forced to ask the question why Last had been permitted to remain in the Vincent's home. It could be argued that his presence was an economic necessity, a necessary evil, so to speak. However, given the relatively high demand for lodgings in the town, it would have been difficult for the Vincents to have found a more amenable lodger. It seems more likely that this toleration lies in the length of time that he'd been lodging with them. As noted above, he'd been living with them for 14 years, and his long-term status, his continual financial contribution to the household purse, for despite having a drinking habit, he was never in arrears with his rent, would have elevated his status in the household, perhaps more like family than lodger. There is no hint of a sexual relationship ever having taken place between landlady and lodger. In spite of the seemingly tolerated violence, however, witness testimonies reveal that Last was still very much a subordinate member of the household. His room at the top floor was described more as a closet than a bedroom. The bedstead upon which he laid, only half covered with a mattress, and his legs were on the bare irons. His landlady's duties of providing lodging and services, but not board, were very clearly defined in this arrangement. So much so that when her lodger was found to be going hungry and unwell, she did little to care for him, much to the criticism of the coroner's court. Indeed, it was concluded that she had been negligent in her duties for a man who had lived under her roof for so long, stating he should have been cared for. Notably, there's absolutely no comment whatsoever about Last's violent behaviour towards his landlady. Indeed, one newspaper report didn't even bother to mention it. So in conclusion, I'll just stop sharing the screen. There we go. So in conclusion, these three examples, among many others I have found, reveals that domestic violence did exist in the landlady-lodger relationship. But as with all other aspects of this transaction, it was far more complicated. And I say transaction here because at the essence of it, this is a transactional relationship. The position of boss lodger brought them many privileges and an elevated status which appears to have sanctified domestic violence in the relationship, yet in other ways they were still subordinate in the household and never ever fully established themselves as a patriarch in the absence of a husband. It's also evident in the final case of John Last that male lodgers enacted violence without retribution upon their landladies, even when no other lines appear to have been crossed, and it seems even if the husband was present in the household. Only when the violence got out of hand did the husband intervene to protect his wife from their lodger. Thank you. That's very strange just speaking to a laptop.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Okay, we will move on to our second paper in this panel and we'll come back for questions. So keep popping your questions in the chat box for Cara to moderate. So our next speaker is Catherine Phipps. She's going to be talking to us on the paper titled Like a Hunted Animal Waiting for Death, Sexual Relationships Between European Women and Muslim Men in French Morocco. Catherine is a doctoral student at University College, Oxford, and her research examines the impact of French imperial presence in Morocco in the early 20th century, and in particular, the kind of intimate aspects of colonial rule. So over to Catherine.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, so as you said, I look at sex and sexuality, particularly in French North Africa, particularly in Morocco. I'm just going to start sharing my screen with you. Fingers crossed that you can all see it. Okay, bear with me for just a second. I'm going to assume that that works because otherwise I can't hear that. Fantastic. So yes, sexual relationships between European women and Muslim men in Morocco in the 20th century. Sex was generally considered to be one of the tools of empire. That is to say, sex between European men and indigenous women or women of colour in other parts of the world. It was generally encouraged as a way to kind of Gallicise French North Africa. However, this is not the case when it comes to European women. So my work at the moment is looking at this circular here. This is a memo that was sent out in April 1941 to the French government in Morocco. And it talks about how there is concerns about relationships that are taking place. These relationships, according to this memo, are considered to be incompatible with the dignity of European women in a Muslim country. And so as a result, the women engaging in them were considered to be dangerous to public security. And French governmental forces were told that they should therefore seize any correspondence that they found to be taking place between European women and Moroccan men. As a result of this memo, there are a number of love letters and phone transcripts available in some of the French archives, which you can see here. And so here, these are letters sent from European women to Moroccan men. As a result of these letters, as a result of the relationships that led to these letters being sent, a number of women were forcibly ejected from Morocco. They were forcibly, or most likely to return to France, or some of them were kept in detention centres in Morocco. However, if you look at the letters themselves, they're a really interesting way to understand some of the kind of emotional space of in French imperialism. Because not only can you see how these women relate to the men they're sending letters to, you can also see, if you look at the scribbled writings on top of them, you can see how the colonial administrators then react to the relationships. So there's almost like a palimpsest of relations going on here, of emotional reactions. And then on the right, you can see this is the transcript of a phone conversation. So you can see how the relationships themselves work, the hierarchies of power that are at play there, which is the most interesting thing, because a lot of the time, so for example, if you look at this letter, if you read what this woman is saying, I'm scared of losing you and the thought makes me like a hunted animal waiting for death. This is a woman named Simone Brutin, who's married to a French colonial administrator, who's writing to a Moroccan man. And you can see how she's completely begging for his affection. She's begging for him to write back to her. So you can see how these gender hierarchies that are present within emotional relationships in the 1940s, how the gender hierarchies have actually reversed the imperial racial hierarchies, which is not very well not appreciated by the colonial administrators. It's the reason that these women were forced to leave Morocco. And this is a dynamic that keeps showing up again and again in the letters. Women begging their Moroccan lovers for affection, or to write back to them, or for this reaction. And again, as I was saying earlier, you can see the emotional reaction that colonial administrators have to the letters. They say, this is disgusting, this is intolerable, can't we make an example of this? You can see the kind of the anger with which they're scrawling and underlining things. And that's because the people reading the letters, the police forces and the security services, they also experienced these letters in an emotional way. They read them and felt a kind of a disgust and anger, which is again part of this history of emotions, this story of emotions taking place in Morocco at this time. For the most part, that's because many of these women, and there are about 92 women that I've come across, many of these women were married to men who were stationed in Morocco, so they were working in the government, or they were working in the armed forces. And there's very much a sense for these men that these are the wives of their colleagues, these are the wives of the people they know. So they experience this this fear about these women who they consider to be a threat of public security. They also consider that to be a threat to private, personal security. They experience this on a deeply kind of personal level, and you can see how this personal history of emotions then is taken on and transliterated into a policy, a governmental policy, which then affects all of these people who are then forced to leave Morocco. So I'm just looking at time. This is the main thing that I want to bring. I think this is an important thing to look at, because it shows how we can understand the emotional space of the empire. And if we bring the history of emotions to the study of empire and sexuality, it shows things in a whole new light. Again, if we're going to talk about these conceptions of hierarchies of race, when we bring these hierarchies of gender to them as well, they become conflated, and it's interesting to see how they interact, because the vast majority of the literature on empire and sexuality has only looked at interracial relationships that have taken place between white men and women of colour. So this is an interesting. This is a new way of looking at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a fascinating paper. We'll have our last one and then we'll come back for the questions at the end. So our final speaker in the panel is Ella. I'm probably going to say your name terribly wrong now. I'm so sorry. Sbaraini? Is that right? Have I got that completely wrong? Hopefully she'll correct me in a minute. So Ella will be talking to us about embodying social emotions, and she is a doctoral student at Clare College, Cambridge. She's working on Suicidal in England and Wales between 1700 and 1850. So over to you.
So hi, my name is Ella, and I'm, as you said, a first year PhD student at Cambridge. I'm presenting on embodying suicidal emotions today, and I'm going to be discussing the embodied nature of suicidality in England from around 1760 to 1860. Firstly, though, I just wanted to really briefly give some historiographical background, both to my PhD, but also to this talk. So yeah, the aim of my PhD is to write a subject-centered history of suicide. By subject-centered, I mean it focuses on the experiences of suicidal subjects, because currently no modern, early modern histories of suicide have kind of been written from the perspective of people who actually felt suicidal, even though they were, of course, the protagonists in every case of suicide. The focus so far has pretty much always been on legal, religious, and literary attitudes towards suicide. The most significant work in this field, Michael MacDonald and Terence Murphy's seminal 1990 Sleepless Souls, is essentially a meta-narrative about changes in attitudes and responses to suicide, and most subsequent Anglophone histories have not only responded to their work, but really kind of taken up its agenda. R.A. Houston's important Punishing the Dead on the right is, in his words, the result of 2 decades of mulling over Sleepless Souls, which focuses not on the meaning of suicide to the people who die, but on the attitudes and behaviour of those who interact with the self-murderer after death. These works have been really edifying, but particularly in a discipline that is interested in emotions and emotionality, a study of suicidal experiences seems long overdue. So if, after E.P. Thompson, History from Below concentrates on the poor and dispossessed, and after Roy Porter, Medical History from Below focuses on patients rather than physicians, I'm kind of trying to write a suicide history from below, which focuses on the suicidal. It's in this context that I've begun to look at the embodied nature of suicidality in this period, something which has never been examined. I'll be arguing that suicidality was often expressed or experienced in profoundly physical ways, and to do this I'm going to be using a mixture of suicide letters and, particularly later in the talk, coroner's inquests. I'm first going to look at one of the major bodily sites of suicidality, which was the head. I'm then going to look at experiences of lowness, and lastly at bodily behaviours or movements. Obviously it's going to be rather brief, but I hope it convinces you of the necessity of having a corporeally minded perspective on this history. So to look first at the head, really striking is the frequency of suicidal authors' references to having hot or burning heads. These often come in the context of expressions of distress or agitation. Mary Atherstone, the wife of a poet, wrote in her suicide letter of 1830 that she felt as if I could scream till it reached heaven or Taunton or Nottingham or all together. My poor head is so hot. This statement about her head comes almost as an experiential materialization of her non-existent scream, a feeling of her anguish almost emanating from one of her body parts. In her suicide letter, Mary Wollstonecraft's descriptions of her hot head were similarly connected to distress. She wrote that, when you receive this, my burning head will be cold. I would encounter 1,000 deaths rather than a night like the last. Your treatment has thrown my mind into a state of chaos, yet I am serene. The chaos in her mind was, it seems, being physically expressed in her burning head, while the prospect of it turning cold seemed to bring with it serenity. Atherstone located her hot head within her own madness. These are her own words, while Wollstonecraft saw it arising from her lover's mistreatment of her. In his suicide note of 1812, Robert Farmer connected it to his poverty, declaring that it has drove me wild and set my brain on fire. In his suicide letter of 1856, Hugh Miller had also written of having a hot head, though here it was explicitly connected with fear as well as distress. He felt that his brain burns, I must have walked, and a fearful dream rises upon me. My brain burns as the recollection grows. Notably, Miller had previously told his physician that he'd experienced fearful night fantasies and felt as if a stiletto had suddenly and as quietly as an electric shock passed through my brain from front to back and left a burning sensation. While such statements point to, in my opinion, a fairly literal experience of heat, a lot of references to the head raise questions of the line between literality and metaphor. And one of the questions I'm pondering is, how can you disentangle the metaphorical and the corporeal in statements like these? The same goes for allusions to wakefulness or experiences of feeling lowered, which are again really common. Atherstone began her letter by expressing that my children's welfare and yours weigh my mind and soul to the depths of misery, portraying her constant worry as a kind of thing pulling her down into gloom. Mr. Mulligan, a suicidal newspaper editor in Bath, had written to his friend in very similar language, complaining in his note of my oppressive feelings, which weigh me down like a millstone. On one level, this language is partly figurative, of course, but it may also have spoken to physical sensations of lowness. Contemporary medics thought melancholia could be expressed and experienced in profoundly physical ways, with Dr. Connolly speaking in 1858 of the drooping of despondency visible in bodily posture. This lowness is evident also in the coroner's inquests. These inquests are inquiries into the cause of someone's death, in which witnesses, usually close to the deceased, were called to give evidence about their pre-suicide behaviour. In the absence of ego documents, like the suicide letters, which are actually really rare, these statements give us unrivaled insights into some of the experiences of otherwise silent individuals. Such is the case with John Allen, who hanged himself in 1806. His close friend told the court how, on the night before he died, he said to me that he had a heaviness in his heart, and mind and appeared very low and dejected. When I went away a little after 8, he wished me good night, but in a very low voice. Obviously, there are metaphors here about low-spiritedness, but it also seems that Alan told his friend about heaviness in his heart and mind, an idea which is potentially suggestive of physical sensations. Perhaps you yourself have experienced the physicality of so-called heartbreak. It's also interesting, of course, that his friend observed that his voice was low, as if this wakefulness impacted on multiple aspects of bodily presence. This lowering language brings me nearer to the end of my talk, where I just want to think briefly about bodily behaviours. In my PhD, I'm thinking about Monique Shear's concept of emotional practices. In brief, Shear argues that it can be fruitful to think of emotions as a kind of practice, as mind-body actions which encompass habitual and intentional behaviour. Crucially, Shear notes that an emotion-as practice approach prevents us from assuming, and I'm quoting here, that the real emotions, the ones worth writing about, are necessarily internal and private, opening up the possibility that third-person accounts of observable behaviour, read with the requisite source criticism, are valid documents of emotional life. As you can imagine, this idea is really pertinent to my use of inquests, because they fundamentally involve third person's observation of suicidality. In these, the idea of observable bodily lowness is again present. According to his friend, Richard Monksfield, who killed himself in 1809, appeared, in the weeks before he died, very low and dejected and never held up his head. While Arthur Brown's friend noted, in the time before his suicide, his head was drooping and he appeared full of thought. A drooping head, or the holding of one's head in one's hands, was seen as bodily evidence of suicidal feelings. As you can see in this print on the left of 1800, and also in Cruikshank's very similar rendition of 1823, suicidal people, who as you can see are being tormented by blue devils, a metaphor for suicidal thoughts, who are holding nooses, razors, poison, and guns, are drooping, lowered figures with a downcast head, and a morose or anguished expression. These are, of course, depictions, and it can be really difficult to disentangle third-person observations of behaviour from expectations, obviously, about what a suicidal person looks like or is doing. That said, I really think that the frequency of these sorts of observations, combined with genuine articulations or first-person articulations of lowness, indicate that wakefulness and lowness were potentially part of the experience of suicidality. While bodily posture may have indicated feelings of lowness, I just really want to briefly mention that the hands are frequently seen as expressive of suicidal anxiety or worry, indicating that different body parts are associated with different suicidal emotions. John Hanson, who killed himself in 1797, was observed wringing his hands and saying, "Oh, my brother, what shall I do?" While Jane Moore, who killed herself in 1778, was seen frequently picking the palms of her hands and frequently humping her hands about and saying, "Oh, I shall go mad, I shall go mad." Again, these are just two of many observations of hands being wrung, slapped, waved about, thrown into the air, indicating, of course, that there were tropes about suicidal behaviours, but also that the hands may have been used to express distress and anxiety and confusion. These final observations conclude this brief talk, but I hope I've convinced you that the body needs to be part of any analysis of suicidality in the past. The head, the hands, posture, and the body at large were intrinsically part of suicidal experiences, which were obviously extremely multifaceted and varied, but also united by some common threads. Thank you.
Thanks, Ella. That was really, really interesting. Thank you. So we won't take up any more of your time. I just want to thank all of our 5 speakers on behalf of myself and Jen. It's been a great session. There's plenty more going on this week, so please do get involved. And thank you all for attending as well. It's been great. I think we've had, 50, 60 people, so I think it's a good turnout. It's more than we would have got, I think, if in person. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone.